Okay, everyone, we're going to get started, so please take your seats. We are live. So good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, January 25th. Welcome to the Ways and Means Committee hearing. Today we will have a briefing by the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, and I would like us to welcome Madam Speaker here to observe today's briefing. So she is joining us today. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And whenever you are ready, whoever's going to go first, please introduce yourself, and I will let you just take it over.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide an update on state revenues. We're going to have a two-part presentation. The first part is I'm going to present an update of our December forecast, talk about some of the risks to that forecast and what our expectations are for the economy. In the second part of the presentation, we'll be providing some data on some recent enhancements to the state earned income credit that were enacted in the 2021 legislative session. Since that time, the Bureau has run a lot of data in the years, kind of get a better understanding of the impact that's had as we adjust our revenues going forward. So with me is Assistant Director Natalia Medinets, and she'll be presenting some data not only on the overall change, but how those enhancements benefited households by income, family structure, and by county. Turning to the December forecast, the official forecast has in fiscal 23 that general fund revenues will total $23.7 billion. That's a decrease of 1.3%. In fiscal 24, we project $25.1 billion. That's an increase of 5.7%. Those total general fund revenues are being influenced by that one-time transfer of $800 million from the personal income tax to the Blueprint Fund as required by Chapter 33 of 2022. Once you take out that impact on an ongoing basis, we project that general fund revenues will increase by 2.4% in 23 and 2.3% in 24. What that reflects is our forecast for the economy, which is slowing not only relative to the last 2 years, which we believe was influenced by the federal pandemic assistance that really pushed up economic growth and our state revenues in the last 2 years. But we also see a slowing economy producing growth that is less than what we see as typical in a year.
I just want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Can you make that full screen? Do you know how to do that? That's okay. That's fine.
We made modest changes over the 2-year period. We did not change our withholding forecast under the personal income tax, corporate income tax, or the sales and use tax. Combined, that's about 70% of the general fund. Turning to fiscal 23, we do have a slight upwards adjustment. That reflects increased expectations for some more minor revenue sources. We're getting more interest income. We had a couple of large estate tax payments, and the insurance premium tax was performing better than expected. However, when we look at fiscal 24, we did reduce our forecast by $166.8 million in total, and that's being driven by a decrease in personal income tax revenues. There were 3 components that changed in our forecast from September to December, one of which partially offset the other 2. First, we received an updated capital gains forecast, and that caused that called for a steeper than previously expected decline in capital gains income. Second, we had more data on refunds in the personal income tax, and we increased the amount of refunds that we expect not only in partially in 23, but also in 24. This decline is partially offset by a decreased amount that we expect to have to set aside to the local reserve account for local income tax distribution. When we go from September to December, we have complete tax year data on 2021. So when we looked at that, that reduced the share that we expect to have to put for future local income tax distribution. Doesn't mean that there's going to be less money, just that we think that we have to set aside less to have those future distributions. Putting the forecast in context, this graph has the average annual growth rates. First, in those blue bars, that's the 5 years before the pandemic. This is kind of what we're pointing to as kind of a typical increase or our trend rate of growth. And the orange bars are the really elevated growth, blistering growth that we've had in the last 2 years, which again is really fueled by the pandemic assistance from the federal government, but we know that that direct impact has dissipated. And looking at our off-fund revenues, not only is it significantly less than the last 2 years, but it's below that 3.6% average annual growth rate that preceded the COVID-19 recession. And looking at the individual income tax, after 2 years, that's now about a quarter larger cumulatively. That's just a lot of growth that has been experienced in the last 2 years. And what has been driving the personal income tax in the last 2 years has not what's driven it historically. Withholding is the biggest component of the personal income tax. And in years prior to the recession, that counted for 70% of the growth in the personal income tax. However, in fiscal 21, estimated payments really drove the growth in revenues, and specifically from pass-through entities that are electing to pay the tax on behalf of their members related to the state and local tax deduction. Turning to fiscal 22 was a story about final payments. We had a lot of unexpected final payments, and that drove the growth that year. And why this matters is this non-withholding income or non-wage income, which includes business income and investment income, including but not limited to capital gains, is more volatile than our other state revenue sources. So as that's increased, this could impact our state revenue structure. I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. I'm just turning to provide a little more detail on our last tax year that finished. Withholding did have a very strong year. Grew by 7.4%. That's well above our kind of pre-pandemic normal average of about 3 to 4%. But that was incorporated in our forecast. Similarly, estimated payments grew by about a third, but that was also assumed in our forecast. What was not, which led to a large amount of that overattainment in revenues in fiscal 22, was this really extraordinary amount of final payments growth of a little over 50%. There's not, you'd have to go back to the first year of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to have a similar magnitude, but even that was not as large as what we experienced last tax year. In addition, that was a federal tax law change filtered down to the state income tax, kind of altering withholding and final payments, whereas this was purely driven by income and not tax law change. And so broadening this to the total general fund revenue of the state, not only is the personal income tax now comprised of more of this non-wage income, but the total general fund revenue collections are comprised more of non-wage income. There has been this long-term growth of greater share of non-wage income. This really has spiked in these last 2 years, So as a result, 1 out of every $5 being deposited in the general fund is from these sources. So all things being equal, the portfolio of our state revenue structure is just a little more volatile than we may have had in the past. So it may not behave in the near term as we've seen it previously because of this change run-up in this non-wage income. So this is one risk that we're highlighting. It's been a welcome development to have this really strong growth in the last 2 years, but it's been driven a lot by this non-wage income. And the second consideration of that is from a budgetary standpoint. Unlike sales and use tax and withholding, where we get that on a monthly basis, we get this on a more irregular basis, and more of this is going to come not only after our December estimate, but after our March estimate. So that is a potential for differences from our estimate. Turning to our capital gains forecast, this steeper decline that I mentioned, we do have a 33% decline in the next 2 years before roughly leveling off at about $15 billion in the out years. So right now, we're getting over $1 billion in income taxes from capital gains, probably closer to about 1.2 to 1.3 billion. But there's also a base effect now. If we have a 10 or 20% decline in that, that's going to have about double the impact on the budget as opposed to maybe 4 or 5 years ago. There have been steeper declines in the past, but these were unusual events. And kind of going more into these forecast risks, fortunately there are a lot of risks in the current environment that we're in. I'm going to highlight 2 of them and really just focusing on the risk of recession and the risk that inflation poses to our forecast. When we look at our most important data, our labor market data, spending, and our major revenue structures, we do not at this point see a concerning decline. What we're seeing is a moderating from these unusually high growth rates. As an example, our withholding revenues, starting in spring of 21, they really took off. And in the next 12 months, they grew by about 10%, really well above what was typical. However, since spring of 22, that has moderated and kind of more normalized, and it's growing at about 5%, and we expect that growth the rest of the year. The labor market, though, is a little bit of a lagging indicator. The one thing that we've been monitoring is, you've probably heard a lot about layoffs, and particularly a lot of major tech companies. We looked at our major layoff notices that are required to be announced in Maryland. And in calendar year 22, they were elevated a little more over 7,000 compared to about 4,000 in a non-recession year. But that was well below the pandemic year when there was about 30,000 economy ground to a halt. But unusually, we are seeing a higher proportion within the professional, scientific, and technical industries, and this really powers our withholdings growth. But we have not seen that. We examined our withholding data, and as of yet, we have not seen that materialize in our revenue data. But this is a situation that we are continuing to monitor. The second risk that I'll discuss is we seem to be in a world where we're having a number of highly unusual occurrences happen frequently, and that also leads to disagreement about what this means and what it means for the economy. And the narrative is changing over time. And going back all the way to when inflation just appeared out of nowhere, thought was, oh, this is transitory. This will go away. An unusual event. That was normal to expect that, but we're just having a lot of unusual occurrences, economic shocks happen. Even within the last month, prior to the last month, the story was the U.S. is slowing, Europe is slowing, China is slowing, and it's probably going to drag the world economy into a world recession. However, China pivoted on their policy in COVID, and it looks like they may contribute to growth. However, that might strain commodities markets, which in turn haven't fully recovered from Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. There's a lot of these events going on that are unusual beyond the state of Maryland that can impact our forecast. And although we aren't forecasting a recession, we expect a soft landing for the Federal Reserve to be able to reduce inflation without tipping the economy into a recession. You've probably heard that a lot of economists are now thinking, well, if it's going to be a recession, that's a mild recession. Well, and what does that mean? Because recessions aren't an either or. They really can vary on their impacts on the state revenue structure, Marylanders, and the economy based on their severity. So what this is on this graph is, I believe, the 15 recessions we've had since the Great Depression, measured in severity in terms of the duration of the recession. As you go out to the right, that's longer in duration. As you go up on the graph, that's a higher peak unemployment, more people out of work. But looking at the last two recessions, these have been really atypical compared to others. The Great Recession was the longest recession since the Great Depression. That was a very long, painful recession and slow recovery. A lot of individuals out of work and had difficulty being reemployed, and that really hurt state revenues for a number of years. When you look at the COVID-19 recession, that was also very unusual. We had a very sharp increase in unemployment as the economy ground to a halt. However, it was very short as the federal pandemic assistance impacted the economy. So when individuals talk about, or economists talk about a mild recession, they're usually referring to the ones in the lower left-hand corner, where you're talking about maybe 6 months to a year of duration and a peak unemployment of about 5 to 7%. Given where unemployment is right now in Maryland and the U.S., if there were to be a recession, probably would be in the lower left-hand corner. But again, with the consensus forecasts being not entirely accurate over the last period, I don't think we can just take it to the bank to say, well, if there is a recession, it's going to be mild. The cautionary tale, I think, is the 1981 and 82 recession. That was unusual, but that's the last time, if you recall, inflation was really elevated like it is now, and the Federal Reserve had to undertake a number of policies to bring it down, and it did cause a severe recession. And again, we're not calling for that. We don't expect either a mild recession or something akin to 1981 or 82. We expect the economy to just kind of muddle through the next couple of years. That kind of provides some context of the environment in which we're in, which there is an elevated risk of recession going forward. And just turning to inflation, since June, there has been a welcome development. There has been this reduction in inflation, where it peaked at over 9%. Now it is running a little bit over 6%. So that's very welcome news. Appears that the policies of the Federal Reserve to intentionally slow down the economy, reduce inflation, are having an impact. However, we're still too. We're not to the conclusion of this process because the Federal Reserve's stated objective of price stability, albeit on a slightly different measure, is 2%. We're far from declaring that we can avoid a recession and that the Federal Reserve is going to be successful controlling inflation. That's the overview of our revenue forecast from December. I'd like to turn now to the earned income credit information, if that's all right. There's most of the legislation, I believe, most or all went through the committee, so there's some familiarity. Just want to set the table in terms of what these enhancements were in the last few years, and also the federal enhancements that were mostly enacted in 2022. So there were, from the state credit, there's really 3 enhancements that were enacted in 2 pieces of separate legislation. First was the Relief Act, a large piece of pandemic assistance from the state during the recession. A related measure to the earned income credit is there was one-time payments made to individuals who were eligible for the earned income credit. That was a very effective way to deliver aid to individuals and to help the economy out. Almost all of the roughly 183 million in economic impact payments that were issued were received in fiscal 21. It was very timely in getting into people's pockets and helping them through the pandemic. Separately, the Relief Act, those 2 enhancements that were made is the credit percentage increased of the federal credit increased to from 28% to 45%. And there was a separate enhancement for the individuals who do not have qualifying children. This was equal to 100% of the federal credit. However, there was a maximum put on of $530. There was an anticipation that the federal government enhance the federal credit, and that would flow through to our state credit. So that $530 maximum was a way to limit the impact that federal enhancement would have on state revenue. These enhancements were temporary, and they applied to tax year 2020 through 2022. Separately, Chapter 40 of 2021 expanded eligibility of the state and local income credits to taxpayers who do not meet federal identity requirements, which generally require a taxpayer to have a valid Social Security number. These taxpayers, for state purposes, file an individual taxpayer identification. By extending eligibility to the earned income credit, it also extended eligibility to state and local poverty tax credits, but those are some more minor credits. So the big impact was state earned income credit. And that also applied to tax year 2020 through 2022. Other recent state legislation in the 2018 legislative session, there was extension of eligibility to individuals who are under 25 years of age. Under federal requirements, current, you have to be between 25 and 64 to claim the earned income credit. Chapter 611 and 612 specified that it eliminated that minimum age requirement for to claim state earned income. And then also in the last legislative session, chapters 110 and 111 established the Maryland Earned Income Tax Credit Assistance Program for low-income families. I believe the House version was sponsored by a delegate from Montgomery County. And this is designed to facilitate claiming of the credit and increase participation. This is a program within the Comptroller's Office, and it will begin with tax year 2025. Then going through, there's also been some changes from the federal government. So there's been a lot of different changes to the earned income credit in these 2 years. The first provision was that federal legislation allowed people to use look-back in terms of their income if they had a decrease in their earnings because of the pandemic. So you could use your 2019 income that was greater, and that would help the individual out. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 also made some significant changes to the federal credit. And these do flow through to the state credit. The more significant measures were temporary, this enhancement of credit for individuals with no qualifying children. But there were also some more modest changes made to the credit on an ongoing basis, one of which was increasing the amount of disqualifying investment that you have. So to put these legislations, the interactions of these together, what we've done is we looked at 2019 data. It's kind of the pre-state and pre-federal enhancements credit. And then we'll be concentrating on tax year 2020 that has mostly only the state enhancements and not the federal. Tax year 2021 includes some of these federal enhancements. In the next part, when we talk about this data, we concentrate on kind of on the change from 19 to 20.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Speaker. Good afternoon, members of committee. We would like to talk to you about our research that we have done on data available to us for state-earned credits. So in tax year 2020, we had 479,000 taxpayers claimed 416 in both refundable and non-refundable credit. Non-refundable credit account for about 1/4 of that amount, or 112 million, and refundable credit is 3/4 of that, 304. Additionally, there was another 75 million claimed against the local income tax. So Robert mentioned before there were two significant legislation that chapters 40 and 39 that impacted tax year 20, and that brought additional 150 million change from year 19 to tax year 20. We saw that out of this 150 million, chapter 40 that enabled 18 filers to claim increased our filer population by about 47,000, brought additional 43 million credits. So the next two slides, we wanted to compare by non-refundable and refundable credits, and we wanted to see where the change is coming from. So the next slide would be, we are looking at non-refundable credits claimed by federal AGI, and the blue bars will show you the number for tax year 19. The gray bars will show the tax year 20. So we see that the difference is not that big, and for all income cohorts, the cumulative would be about 9 million. We would assume that, we not assume, we know that out of those 9 million, 8 million is coming from new IT taxpayers. The next slide that is on page 19 is looking at the similar comparison, but for refundable portion of credit. By the way, all the numbers are in millions. So when we are looking at the comparison of tax year 19 and tax year 20, we see the big change. And the majority of that change is happening for income for the taxpayers with income below 35,000. So out of this 150 million, 8 million is coming from IT filers, non-refundable part of the credit. Then there is another 35 million that is coming from refundable credit, same IT filers. This is the change that was brought in by chapter 40. There is 27 million change that was due to the Relief Act, chapter 39, and change was for the taxpayers without qualifying children. And the last piece of this 150 would be 79 million, and those are due to the change for the percent increase for taxpayers with kids from 28% to 45%. So we were trying to dissect how the difference is appearing. The next slide, we're just looking at the different composition of tax year 20. And we see that the chart is following basically the credit structure for taxpayers with lower adjustable gross, federal adjusted gross income. We see that the refundable credit has bigger share, but as income grows, so the tax liability of taxpayers grows, and then non-refundable part gets bigger and bigger. And the next slide, we are looking at the characteristics of our taxpayers in 2020 who are claiming refundable credit. More than 85% were either single or head of households. 41% of the filers do not have qualifying children. 59% have at least one qualifying child. However, those 59%, they account for 87% of all the dollar amount for the credit. Now, the next slide, we were trying to see the average credits claimed by taxpayers in tax year 20. So for taxpayers without qualifying children, the average non-refundable credit was a little below $100. For taxpayers with one or three or more qualifying children, it was $523. This is non-refundable. And for taxpayers with two children, it's $575. The numbers are bigger if you would look at their refundable credit. For taxpayers without qualifying children, it's slightly below 300. For taxpayers with one qualifying child, it's 900. With two children, it's 1,400. Three or more children, it's 1,700. The next slide, we were looking at average increase that chapters 39 and chapter 40, how they impacted the average credit. So we see that for taxpayers without qualifying children, the increase was over 200% from tax year 19 to tax year 20. And for taxpayers with qualifying children, it was about 50%. Now, our last table that we would like to share with you has a lot of information in it. It's breaking down the refundable credits by count. The second and third columns are showing the amount of claims and total dollar amount claimed. We see that the biggest impact in terms of both count and amount are in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Baltimore City, and Baltimore County. However, we were also looking at different metrics. The third column is a percentage of total returns, meaning we took the count of all returns that claimed a refundable credit over the total number of returns in the county. And we saw that the picture changed. The highest percentage belongs to Somerset County, then is Dorchester County, and Baltimore City again, and then it's Wicomico County. Another statistics is the amount per capita. So this is basically if you take for county the whole amount of refundable credit claimed, and we divide it by all people claiming in the county. So we see that the biggest impact is in Dorchester County, Wicomico County, and Baltimore City. Final last one would be the benefit increase. We are looking at the increase for per capita amount. And the largest increase we would see in Prince George's County, Dorchester, Wicomico counties, and then in Baltimore City. So we see that the credits is highly utilized not only in urban areas of our state, but also in rural. That's pretty much what we wanted to share with you. Thank you much for your attention.
Thank you. We appreciate that. It was a lot of information. Does the committee have any questions? Delegate Hornberger.
Hit it again? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Speaker, for joining us in the committee. I'm not a economist, as you can see, but I do have a question about the earned income tax credit, because we debate this a lot in our committee. The criteria to capitalize on the EITC my understanding is twofold. One has to file taxes, right, in order to receive it, and then there's some income thresholds. Is that accurate?
Yes, and there's also, with the federal credit, there's also a lot of other qualifications that you have to meet.
Okay. The other question that I had, and again, this is a debate amongst my colleagues, is does one have to have income, be it through work, be it through some other means, to opt in and file and receive the earned income tax credit?
Yes, they do. You have to have earned income.
Right.
So you have to have wages in order to claim the credit.
Okay.
This was designed as a way to supplement wages.
Great. So just to clarify, in order to get the earned income tax credit, you have to work and you have to file your taxes.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
Delegate Jones.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you, Speaker, for joining us. Thank you so much for this presentation. On page 8, you spoke briefly about the 2-year decline in capital gains. Could you just go over that a second for me? I'm sorry. I didn't hear the cause for that.
Okay, sure. Last year was really a tough year for not only equities but also bonds.
Oh, got it.
The broader market was down, I think, by about a fifth, and that was after a lot of cumulative increases in the previous years. So that reflects that kind of tough conditions.
Thank you.
Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for this informative presentation. I just wanted to ask about the discussion around the labor market. I think you mentioned, Mr. Rehrman, that the labor market was strong, but that we were seeing layoffs. Is there particular areas? Can you unpack that more in terms of the types of layoffs that we're seeing here in Maryland?
Sure. So those layoffs were, and these are only the kind of the mass layoffs that are significant ones where they have to file harm notices. So that's what we've looked at. So it has been relatively broad-based in different industries, but in calendar year 22, unusually had some of these what we think of kind of some higher average wages in this professional and scientific industry. So these are not only tech industries, but the high-tech manufacturing, firms like that. So that was a little unusual in that regard. And this isn't quite where we're seeing it, but one worrying recent development is the time to get reemployed getting a little bit longer previous. We can expect that. On the other hand, there is still a lot of job openings. So it gives us some hope that as either hiring slows or there are layoffs, that relative to Great Recession certainly, or other recessions, that people will be able to regain reemployment quickly.
Delegate Feldmark, then Delegate Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation, and I probably have a few more questions to follow up after I have a chance to digest more. But actually, following up on the layoff data, so when we receive those layoff notifications, what's the threshold for number of positions terminated to require that?
I do not recall them at this point. I think there's a two-part. It's either if there's a closure or a significant event, but I can get you those details.
Okay. And so does that come with some position identification, whether it's a NAICS code or something, or is it?
It'll actually, the company is listed, and then they also have their NAICS code.
Okay.
So that's the data that we ran on that. And I should preface it, it doesn't always happen, but this is the notification required, so it does give us a little bit of a forward look of what might be occurring.
Okay. And the requirements for those notifications, is that something in state law or is that a federal requirement?
It might be joint. I know there is a state requirement.
Okay.
is under the Department of Labor, but I can get you more details as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Delegate Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for being here. I have a question on slide 3. So where you have your corporate income tax and the sales tax, the change from estimation, all of them at 0 for 23 and 24. I'm a little surprised to hear that your model is so good. So I just want to see how do you do it? Or I missed something there.
We didn't change relative to the September forecast, because year to date, based on the available information we had, that they were performing in line with expectations. So in September, the board adopted a little bit more conservative forecast than what our consultants had. So even though as we moved from September to December, the outlook got a little worse, that was kind of baked in, if you will, to our forecast. So that ended up causing us to not change our forecast.
So the same for sales tax as well?
Yes.
I see. Thank you.
Delegate Wells.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here, Madam Speaker. I think I may have answered my question potentially, but I wanted to go back to, I think it was slide 18, and this is following on the conversation around labor and the job market, but I was wondering, and maybe you might help to illuminate what I'm looking at a little bit better than, but I really took note of the idea of that as your income increases, then you're less likely, your tax liability also increases, and then your use of the different tax credit programs decreases. And I'm wondering if there's any way for us to dig deeper into, like maybe if it's dollar, as your income or wage goes up per dollar, what have you, is there any modeling that we can look at where we can dig a little bit deeper into, hour per wage, how those changes have an impact on the use of certain tax credits that are income-based tax credits specifically? Sure.
So, sorry to use economic speak, but sort of like an elasticity of,
Correct.
As your wage changes, what would be the change in your earned income credit? We can do that based on the data we have and get that data to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for joining us. She, of course, has other business that she has to attend to, so we appreciate her being here with us today. The Vice Chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and obviously thanks to our speaker for being here as well. I was asking the chair, and she clarified it a lot to me, but maybe it might be also just unclear to a lot of the new members that are here of how the Bureau of Revenue Estimates works within the Comptroller's office and the connection or the independence. Like, can you just give me your structure, staff that work for you? Maybe that would be really helpful for all of us so we know like clearly what your role is for us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Thank you for asking that question. So within the Bureau, we have a staff of about 8 currently. We Director, myself, Assistant Director, Talia, and Deputy Director, David Farkas. He's manning the shop, getting the fiscal notes together. But statute does have some independence built into the Bureau. So kind of in the general process, we, and given the importance of the general fund revenue forecast, it's really critical for these nonpartisan estimates, and that statute does provide for that. So the Bureau is responsible with the Revenue Monitoring Committee in producing consensus estimates. This is a great process. First, we produce the estimate, oftentimes for these different taxes, and the Revenue Monitoring Committee is comprised of members from MDOT, DBM, DLS, and the Treasurer's Office. And before we submit this to the Board of Revenue Estimates, we have to reach a consensus RMC committee. So this really improves our process. A lot of fiscal officers on that committee deep knowledge of state taxes, and then also it helps get buy-in from multiple agencies throughout state government for our forecast. Once we receive that, reach consensus, That forecast is presented to the Board of Revenue Estimates, and that is comprised of the Comptroller, Secretary of Budget Management, and the Treasurer.
And the vice chair was being gracious. Really, George explained it. Not the chair. So, there's that. Delegate Jones.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Just quickly, Director, on slide 10, where we talk about the impacts of recession, and I appreciate this slide overall in many different ways, especially as it pertains to the recession in the 80s, which in my opinion was due, I mean, we got hit really hard in a reduction in manufacturing that not only hurt America, but specifically in Maryland, hurt parts of our state with our middle class and our working class when we lost those labor jobs, right? But I thought I heard you use a phrase, and I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you say that we were at an elevated risk of recession? Was that the phrase that left your mouth?
Currently, right now, yes.
Because it made me stop and gasp for air, but I just wanted to make sure I heard that right.
Yes. We do look at elevated risk of recession in the near term.
Yeah.
And that is that downside risk to our forecast, since we do not incorporate it.
I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay, are there any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for sharing that information and briefing the committee today. Committee, that adjourns our briefing for today. We will resume tomorrow.